Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger and today I'm here to talk about violence and human sacrifices in the Viking Age. Well, how much of it is true? And the war Scandinavians of the Iron Age really within an extreme violent society? Well, in terms of violence, if we are talking about Vikings as an occupation which was mostly maritime related and going abroad on raiding expeditions, but also later on developing into colonizing efforts, indeed, we could say those who went Viking were indeed within a violent culture, because we are mostly talking about a type of gang mentality. But not all Scandinavians were Vikings, the great majority being on the category of providers, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, weavers, etc. However, we do see evidences of extreme violence outside the gang mentality of being or going Viking, and outside, of course, the general internal conflicts by waging battle and war to settle disputes. There are both literary and archaeological evidences of violence within a specific Iron Age Scandinavian religious perception. In fact, there's a clear behavioral pattern of human sacrifices, and of animals as well, towards a religious understanding, or rather aiming at achieving something religiously speaking. On this video, I'm mostly going to focus on the human sacrifices and violence in general terms. I actually also thought about including raping, sexual intercourse against someone's will, turning that person into a victim of sexual assault and abuse, which quite often, for many decades now, the Viking Age society has been portrayed as having a rape mentality and a rape culture, but I think that is a subject for another time, and I plan on delivering a video just to focus on that particular aspect. So, we see in many movies and TV series, even books, that focus on a commonly generalized idea about the Viking Age of a lot of violence, particularly bloodshed and violence against the other. Of course, there are exaggerated motifs. However, it is clearly difficult to separate reality from fiction in these specific points that deal much more with human behavior towards the other. The image of the savage barbarian Viking covered in blood of its enemies and celebrating on the slaughter and battle carnage has been quite the common portrayal in modern media representations of Scandinavian invaders since the 1950s. Obviously, material culture helps a lot to understand part of the mentality of past peoples, but fortunately, in this context at least, Old Norse society also left us very important literary testimonies that help in a better understanding of the mentality of the time. Not only in the temporal context, but also in the social context and even the perception of the world of these societies. Paying close attention to the influence of medieval literary sources, including the Icelandic sagas of the 13th century, it is not that strong, the image of the Iron Age and medieval Nordic peoples of being bloodthirsty, savage beasts. Modern cinematography and literature have had this tendency to continue to present or portray this idea that the Vikings lived in a society where glorifying violence was a social norm. Of course, there were bloody acts within a social context, many in a more metaphorical framework of human behavior, but some quite authentic, quite literal, that lead us to think about these specific moments of sudden and heavy violence in a religious context that is difficult for us to understand, at least for the modern mentality. Well, looking at the evidences we have, especially literary ones, there are indeed violent acts of excessive brutality that the modern media has passed on as common acts, almost reflecting sadistic pleasures. However, literary sources present, in most cases, these violent acts as rare and regrettable in a panorama of necessity, madness, conflict as a means of survival, or unfortunate tragedy by force of fate, and not as the glorification of violence. And I think one of the most violent acts we can imagine in Old Norse society is perhaps the most controversial and shocking act of violence, the so-called blood eagle, the blood eagle punishment. Interestingly, capital punishment was a relatively rare feature in medieval Scandinavian law. Death sentences were not that common in Old Norse society. In fact, the evidences, literature and laws of that time and within that society point much more towards a respect for life, to a certain extent, so much so that even in the act of murder, the killer would have to pay compensation to the victim's family. And in extreme cases, of course, the criminals were expelled from the community to live in a savage state out there in the wilds, which in itself is an indirect act of death sentence. But however, the person was not executed, but could be hunted by anyone. However, the freedom to escape and survive by one's own means was allowed, was given. But is the blood eagle really the most brutal punishment in Viking Age society, or a modern presumption? Well, yes, we are faced with erroneous modern conceptions about the real practice. The blood eagle does not usually appear on the list of violence attributed to Viking Age Norsemen. It only appears in short excerpts of texts, almost all of which have to do with the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, who is said by chronicles and sagas to have been active in the 9th century as an invader, a king, and a conqueror of England. For decades, however, scholars have debated the accuracy of the reports, and not only about the authenticity of Ragnar Lodbrok as an historical figure, but also about the use of this form of punishment, the blood eagle, largely failing to reach any definitive conclusion. According to Saxo Grammaticus in his Gesta Danorum and the Icelandic sagas Ragnar Saga Lothrokkar and Ragnarsson Naltauthur, the blood eagle is a punishment given to King Helle of Northumbria by Ragnar's sons in response to having ordered Ragnar to be thrown into a pit of poisonous vipers. Helle is subjected to various variations of this gruesome execution in several versions of the text about Ragnar as a form of revenge, right? It is entirely possible that this ritual was a feature in Norse society. It is also possible that this is a literary motif where the worst criminals are subjected to the worst punishments that the mind can contrive, in an act of extreme hatred and perhaps even a conception of destroying the enemy's body to prevent his return to the world of the living. Of course, taking into account the fear of the returning dead, the vengeful dead, the harmful dead, as we see in Norse literature, that they are not merely ghosts, but rather have a corporeal existence, returning with their physical bodies and causing real destruction and death. Generally because they were evil in life or seeking revenge. And this act of the blood eagle may have once been a form of bodily destruction to prevent the return of the most evil and cursed people in this society. But that is speculation, right? What we do know is that textual evidence is contradictory and often subjective, especially in relation to the blood eagle. There appears to be little evidence that this practice actually existed, or if it did, that it was a common practice. This is just one example, of course, perhaps one of the most brutal and gruesome ones, but it seems to have been purely a literary composition. Old Norse society was neither exclusively bloodthirsty nor excessively passive. Textual and historical evidences suggest that unnecessary cruelty was not ingrained within Viking Age Norse society. Of course, speaking here in context outside of the world of war. However, there are brutal accounts of human sacrifices. I think it is important to take on an animistic approach to this, just briefly highlighting a few points spoken here before on another video. The case of sacrifice in animism gives us a glimpse into the mentality behind the act of sacrificing a life, be that of an animal or a human being. Without a doubt, it is a ritualization of death in a religious performance that is performed either towards an expression of devotion or to obtain something beneficial, or both, of course. Often it is an act to express devotion towards the gods in exchange for something beneficial. We are face to face with the problem of death. Grandmother, is that you? Speaking of the dead, well, as I was saying, we are face to face with the problem of death, the act of taking a life, as a taboo within animistic societies. However, the idea of taboo isn't solely something that is forbidden, but also something that is understood as having a high negative impact upon the society that breaks social and/or religious taboo. But sometimes it is necessary an extreme action that goes against taboo for whichever reason. So human societies try to find ways around taboos to perform an act against taboo in order to survive and ensure survival. As much as it seems normal to our modern society to have a piece of meat in our plate, in many animistic societies, the killing of an animal is not only a problem because one is ending a life, but also the case of eating souls. Something spoken here before on another video. Yet, obviously, animistic human societies find ways around this taboo and occasionally take a life in order to consume the flesh. There must be the right propitiation of the soul which has been robbed of its body. There must be a whole set of ritualized performances to appease the spirit, give thanks, utilize its body parts, and so on and so forth according to each animistic society and the culture in which they are inserted. Looking at Old Norse narratives and mythology, we understand that, like in all other myths and the religions and belief systems, death is something undesirable, unexpected, and there are many attempts to avoid it or to challenge it. And like in all religious beliefs, there's always some explanation for the origins of death as well as a purpose or meaning to it. And this is one of the points to go around taboo, precisely to create a religious meaning and purpose for death in order to provoke it. As soon as there is a purpose, ritual is created around it, turning death into something sacred. Many religions find justifications and purposes for certain actions, even the most horrible ones. And that's what happened when it comes to Scandinavian belief systems around the act of sacrificial death. There's a purpose for a greater benefit. This sort of mentality spread through religiosity and gives justification for the act. It doesn't matter if nowadays it makes absolutely no sense at all, but it did for those people of the past, because the justification and purpose fit perfectly well with the needs, beliefs, and superstitions of the time. The act of hunting itself within animistic societies goes against the taboo of taking a life, yet it is done sometimes nonetheless, because the action of hunting is sacramental. It is transformed into a ritual process to which it is given a justification and purpose, making the act of hunting a sacrifice. This is the only difference between killing and sacrifice. Both take a life, but sacrifice gives a purpose in the mentality of the community that performs the sacrifice. Hunting and being hunted is sacrificial, when the act is done towards a justifiable purpose. Many of you know I'm vegan, but I'm not here expressing my own view on the subject, but rather briefly, very briefly, expressing the general animistic mentality on sacrifice and why killing is transformed into a sacrifice rather than a murder. Sacrifice is sacramental. It is a form of transcendence, giving it a value above the simple act of dying. Sacrifice is death with a purpose, within the religious mentality. So it is acceptable because of the ideas it gives to the act as being a way to bring forth something greater and beneficial to the community. Sacrifice is a culturally appropriated and acceptable form of killing. Not because of any divine law, but because these sentiments are created within the religious sphere. What is acceptable and appropriate or appropriated for a culture isn't for another. So sacrifice is justifiable through religiosity. This gives us a better idea why within Viking Age society capital punishment was rare and why there were distinctions between murder and sacrifice. Killing without purpose and without religious justification was a crime. Sacrificing a life was not, and the sacrifice of a human being was publicly displayed and accepted because this destruction of life has a religious purpose. The same way it was perfectly normal to publicly hang and behead people throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period and beyond, because it was accepted and normalized by law and people complied. Everything is permitted within a society if to it is given a cultural and religious justification. And that's it. It is completely illusionary. What is accepted or not depends on the cultural indoctrination people are born in and the normalization of certain acts. Human sacrifice was normal in certain societies because there was justification for it. Just the same way, even today, in certain societies, still, cannibalism is also accepted because there are justifications for it that fit into the religious and cultural mentality of the people that do it. So sacrifice is sacramental, becoming an acceptable way of killing the other, because it was religiously justifiable in many societies, including in Old Norse society. And I'm not here trying to historically or otherwise justify this action because I'm obviously absolutely totally against that shite. I'm simply expressing the mentality behind the act and why it was done. Sacrifice becomes an extreme act to reinforce or strengthen the relationship the human community has with the entities towards whom the sacrifice is meant for. As already mentioned here in a previous video in relation to the funeral practice for Thorir that we see in Robert Haggard's film The Northman from 2022, which is also portrayed in the film The 13th Warrior, we have a specific scene of human sacrifice of a enslaved person who is killed to accompany her master in the afterlife. These cinematic characterizations are based on the writings of Ibn Fadlan, an emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 10th century who traveled through the Volga River region. In both films, we watch a woman who is sacrificed to join her recently deceased sovereign, a choice made willingly, at first, it would seem, according to the sources. But then she changes her mind when face to face with reality. In the 1999 film The 13th Warrior, this scene is more subtle, while in the more recent film, the death of this enslaved woman is a little bit more graphic, yet remains in the background. Ibn Fadlan's description is much more explicit and brutal. I've talked about this before, so we won't have to focus on the gruesome details again. Curiously, here we have the opposite of what was spoken previously. While several films and books have highlighted the brutality and violence of the northern barbarians, which does not correspond to historical truth, also films and series about human sacrifices from the Scandinavian Iron Age do not actually demonstrate that human sacrifices were much more brutal according to historical sources we have. Okay, here we go. In Ibn Fadlan's account, the enslaved girl volunteers to her death at first, but she soon begins to decide not to do so. However, the others present at the funeral ceremony did not accept this. She is dragged to a death chamber where 6 men rape her in a group. Later, while 2 men strangle her with a rope, another person repeatedly stabs her in the chest with a dagger in order to eventually kill her. Raped, strangled, stabbed, murdered, not to mention her altered state of consciousness that was purposely caused or induced to take away self-control of this person, of the victim, so that she can be sacrificed without fighting against it. And this is just an example. Interestingly too, in all the historical sources about the Vikings and the Iron Age and the medieval Scandinavian and the Nordic world, we never find, mind you, we never find an episode where a person voluntarily accepts being sacrificed. And I think also in the Viking series, right, we also have a case where Ragnar Lothbrok and Lagartha in Uppsala are willing to sacrifice their enslaved monk Ethelstain, but he doesn't want to do it, so another character volunteers for it. This issue of volunteering to be sacrificed is something we don't really see in historical sources. Christian and Arab writers mention the brutality of these sacrifices, which may seem to many people to be an exaggeration coming from religious propaganda against the pagan people of the north and their customs. However, even Scandinavian and Icelandic sources, such as the sagas, describe the human sacrifices as made by use of force and trickery, and especially brutal. Let's take the example of King Olaf. In Ynglinga saga, for example, tells us how King Olaf did not sacrifice often, and this displeased the Swedes, who believed that the famine was caused by the king's carelessness and lack of sacrifice. So there was a very bad time of hunger, of difficulties, and the Swedes attributed this to the lack of sacrifice made by their sovereign, who, after all, the local elite controlled the religion and publicly displayed to the subjects the rituals and sacrifices to the gods, for a variety of things, including for a prosperous and peaceful time. This wasn't happening. So they summoned an army, the people summoned an army and marched against the king. Taking him by surprise, they burned him alive in his home and gave him to Odin as a sacrifice for a good year. And it worked. Take note of that. When you see those t-shirts and memes saying, "Save the planet, eat a billionaire," I mean, technically, yeah, it works. Although I wouldn't say eat them, literally eat them, as in that way we enter the problematic question of cannibalism and all the morals and taboos around it. But I say probably once in a while, sacrifice the patriarchy. Anyway, if human sacrifices in the historical, cultural and religious context of Iron Age Scandinavia were not made with volunteers, why does cinema and television series insist on portraying them this way? But on the other hand, it is absolutely normal to portray brutality and extreme violence in other ways. And why is this? Well, in films, TV series and such, we are faced with the heroization, the act or the result to make someone an heroic figure. Heroization of a character, which the audience will follow and empathize with. In our society, there is a normalization of violence in very specific fields in which we find justification for the act, but in the issue of human sacrifice, we no longer find, nowadays, this justification and purpose. In the same way that, let's say, the West finds it normal and acceptable and absolutely accepts the death of a cow to eat it, but this is something repugnant in India. And just as it is accepted to have a dog and a cat as pets, but not other animals, and however, in other countries, eating dog is socially and culturally acceptable. Although, actually, in Europe, until very recently, until the 1950s, many countries still ate dog and horse. But then the mentality changed, and one is a pet now, and the other isn't killed for food but is used, and there's a fine line between being a pet companion and the means to be exploited. Makes absolutely no sense. So, in these films, in the heroization of the main character, for the majority of the audience, we do not want to associate the hero with practices that we no longer agree with nor see justification for. Although societies that sacrificed humans had justification and purpose for that act. We are not just talking about human hypocrisy, but mostly about the illusion of what is acceptable and justifiable and what is not, simply based on religious moralistic rhetoric that has come to have great weight on our society. Sometimes something is normalized and accepted. Then at another point it is no longer. Then it is again. Religion as a means to control the collective mentality. That's why films and TV series include this element of a voluntary element to be sacrificed when dealing with this historical subject in past societies. Because if it is voluntary, then to this whole process is given freedom that is easier for the audience to digest. However, historically speaking, human sacrifice was not voluntary. But then it's also curious how cinematography leans to only one side on moral issues. European context of human sacrifice gives rise to this issue of volunteering and therefore an illusionary freedom for which the audience already finds some justification that is easier to accept. On the other hand, a movie such as Mel Gibson's Apocalyptic, whatever, which I actually enjoyed, the portrayal of human sacrifice in the Maya civilization as something forced, not voluntary, quite brutal, absolutely horrific. When in fact we, Europeans, we were doing the exact same thing. But now in movies it is softened with this volunteer aspect to the sacrifice. So yeah, Viking Age Scandinavians did human sacrifice, and there was nothing romantic and glamorous about it. It was brutal and violent. However, for that period and society, there was justification for it under their own belief systems. And there are several examples. For instance, in Inglingathal, King Domaldi was sacrificed at Uppsala to end a long-lasting famine. King Aun, to live longer, sacrifices 9 sons. The first son gives him 60 new years, and the 8 following sons give him 10 years each, right? When Aun wanted to sacrifice his 10th son, the Swedes led the son away and Aun died. The Jarl Håkon in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason sacrificed his son to gain victory over the Vikings. Even though these later Icelandic accounts report to something done in previous centuries, they also show similarities with Viking Age, Christian and Arab chronicles. And human sacrifice in Iron Age Scandinavia was a thing. Although it may not have been something that would happen all the time, but at specific moments, especially of a religious character, and people were sacrificed. We just have to take a look at, for instance, the archaeological evidences of bog bodies in Iron Age Denmark and previous periods as well, with clear signs of human sacrifice, with a religious purpose, not a voluntary sacrifice, quite brutal, quite violent, and this religious act continued on throughout Scandinavia. There was a purpose, there was a justification, and so it was normalized. In movies and TV series, depicting Viking death rituals as consensual solves the paradox that human sacrifice presents to modern moral sensibilities, allowing us to tolerate it as a prerogative of pagan beliefs while still providing victims with freedom and dignity. Dying, being killed, appears to be ethically defensible in this case because all parties enter into this sort of bargain out of their own free will. But in reality, it wasn't like that. It is the romanticism and poetic embellishment of these themes for a modern audience. But in reality, it was quite brutal and violent. As said before, in Viking Age Scandinavian laws, there was a clear difference between killing and manslaughter, and capital punishment was rare, demonstrating a greater respect for life. But that's because we are talking about death-related contexts in a societal ambience where law dictates what is socially acceptable or not. When it comes to religious contexts, however, the moral beliefs were different, and the sacrifice of a person was seen as sacramental, justifiable by religious notions and given a purpose under the belief systems of the collective mentality, therefore acceptable. These films and series that bring this idea of voluntary sacrifice have a very negative role in the critical capacity of human beings, because they avoid putting the viewer in a position where they have to make an ethical judgment against paganism or against the historical past. And this is called moral persuasion. But we have to be aware of the truth to question these situations and avoid making the same mistakes and atrocities. There is a certain normalization of violence here that must be reflected upon, so that people finally realize that there is no justification for violence and taking a life, because these justifications are just temporal illusions that are instilled in us by organizations that intend to destroy all of our critical power and prevent us from questioning the system that exists with the functionality to control us. Not to mention that in terms of a good historical understanding of issues of past mentalities and what led people to do what they did, these films and TV series do not help with the religious and cultural understanding of a time. This is something that is essential for us to try to understand, so that we can also understand the various issues of art and the material culture in general that reflects the religious and cultural understandings of the period. So, my dear friends, I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.